The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting a warm, golden hue across the mid-sized American city. The streets were alive, people moving about with purpose, carrying on with their daily routines. In the distance, the hum of city life mixed with the sound of distant traffic, punctuated by the occasional shout of kids playing basketball, the jangle of a bicycle bell, and the low rumble of a bus pulling into the stop. It looked like a regular day, one of those moments when everything feels normal, when you can almost convince yourself that nothing's ever going to change. But there was something off, something just beneath the surface, a feeling that the peace was fragile. Recent tensions between the local police department and the community had been in the air like a storm cloud, just waiting for the slightest shift in the atmosphere to let loose. Walking down the sidewalk, Marcus, a 15-year-old high school sophomore, had no clue about the storm brewing on the horizon. He was in his usual after-school groove, headphones in, hoodie on, hands tucked into his pockets, his stride easy and confident as he made his way home. The neighborhood was familiar. The corners of these streets were lined with stores he'd walked past 100 times. He had the casual air of a kid who belonged, who was part of the fabric of this place, no questions asked. As Marcus turned onto a side street, he saw the unmistakable blue and white of the police patrol car parked just a few yards ahead. His stomach did a little twist, but he shrugged it off. Police officers, while not a rare sight in this area, weren't exactly friends either. Still, he kept his head down, not eager for any interaction. That's when it happened. From the corner of his eye, Marcus saw the shadow of a tall figure step out in front of him, blocking his path. Another officer followed suit, positioning themselves behind him, almost in a way that suggested they were herding him. A third officer, younger and looking slightly out of place in his freshly pressed uniform, lingered near the car, as if unsure of how to proceed. "Hey!" one of the officers barked. His voice was authoritative, but a bit too sharp for the moment. "What are you doing here?" Marcus paused, then looked up slowly. There was no sense of alarm in his posture, just confusion. He'd walked this same route every day for the past 2 years, but today, something was different. "I'm going home," Marcus answered, his voice casual, almost bored. "What's it to you?" The officer's eyes narrowed, his lips tightening into a thin line. He stepped closer, too close for comfort. "You got a name?" Marcus blinked, feigning surprise. "What, you don't know it already?" He glanced sideways at the other 2 officers, trying to read their faces, but they all looked too focused on him. The new guy stood slightly apart, looking around uncomfortably, as if he wasn't sure whether to speak up or not. "Don't get smart with me," the officer snapped. "You're walking around here like you own the place. What are you really up to?" Marcus let out an exaggerated sigh, trying to shake off the tension. "Maybe I'm just walking, you know? Wild concept, I know." His lips twitched into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. He wasn't really joking. The officer's frown deepened, clearly not appreciating the tone. "You think this is funny? You look suspicious, too suspicious to be just walking." At this, Marcus tilted his head, genuinely baffled. Suspicious? He looked down at himself, hoodie, jeans, sneakers, nothing out of the ordinary. "Man, I'm just trying to get home. You're the one stopping me, not the other way around." The officer stepped even closer now, crossing a line that felt intentional. The young recruit shuffled awkwardly to the side, clearly uncomfortable with how things were escalating. "I've had enough of this," the officer growled. "What's your name, kid?" Marcus just stared at him for a moment, weighing his options. He could feel the energy in the air shift, like something big was coming, but he wasn't sure what. So he shrugged again, playing it off as nonchalantly as he could. "Name's Marcus. But I guess it's a little too late for pleasantries, huh?" The officers exchanged a look, and Marcus noticed the brief flicker of doubt in the recruit's eyes. That wasn't enough to stop them, though. They kept their position, firm, unfazed, ready to press. Somewhere in the back of Marcus's mind, a voice told him to be careful. But for now, he wasn't worried. They had no reason to stop him after all. Did they? This scene sets the stage for what's about to unfold. It's light, with moments of humor from Marcus's sarcastic quips, but it carries a sense of something darker looming. The tension builds gradually, and we get our first taste of the unwarranted aggression Marcus is about to face. Marcus stood there, still holding his ground, trying to process what was happening. The sun had dipped lower now, casting long shadows across the street. The air had gone from warm to slightly cool, but it wasn't the chill in the wind that made his skin prickle. It was the energy surrounding him, the kind of tension you could feel in your chest, like something was about to break. "What's your last name, Marcus?" the officer asked again, this time leaning in a little too close. "Really?" Marcus replied, raising an eyebrow. "You're seriously asking for my last name now? I thought we were past that. I mean, is my first name not enough for you?" The officer, tall, middle-aged, his hair thinning at the temples, didn't smile. His eyes stayed cold, scanning Marcus like he was a problem to be solved, not a kid just trying to get home. "Just give it to me and we can move on." "You look like you're hiding something," the officer insisted, his tone carrying that all-too-familiar superiority that seemed to fill the space between them. Marcus rolled his eyes, the sarcastic smile he'd worn earlier starting to fade into frustration. "Oh, I look like I'm hiding something? What, because I don't match your suspicious profile?" He gestured vaguely at himself, his hoodie, his sneakers. "What exactly am I hiding, officer? My advanced calculus homework?" The officer didn't respond to the sarcasm. Instead, he pressed, "Where are you coming from? And don't tell me school again." Marcus felt the knot in his stomach tighten. This was going nowhere. "Yeah, I came from school," he said slowly, like he was explaining it to someone who might not understand. "You know, the one down the street? Where kids go to learn? The place where you're supposed to leave us alone after hours?" The other officer, taller, with a scar running down his cheek, shifted his stance slightly. He glanced over at the recruit, who was still standing by the car, looking uncomfortable but not intervening. The recruit's unease was evident. He fidgeted with the edge of his sleeve, his eyes darting between Marcus and the officer, pushing the questioning. He had that look, like he wasn't sure where the line was, or if he was supposed to speak up. Marcus caught the glance, and for a second, he almost felt sympathy for the kid. He was probably new, probably trying to prove himself, but the more he thought about it, the more Marcus realized. It didn't matter. They were all complicit in this game, whether they knew it or not. "I mean," Marcus said, stepping back a little as if to indicate the absurdity of it all, "can't I just take a walk without being interrogated? Maybe you guys are new to this whole public service thing, but where I'm from, being a civilian isn't a crime." His voice was louder now, more pointed. The older officer ignored the remark. Instead, his face hardened as he reached for his radio. "You're acting real defensive for someone who has nothing to hide," he muttered, just loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Stay put." Marcus's pulse quickened. The tension in the air had shifted. This wasn't just a casual stop anymore. It was becoming something else. He could feel it. In the way the officer's hand hovered near his belt, in the way the other officer's eyes darted to the side like they were expecting something. The older officer's voice dropped low, but still sharp. "Look, kid, you're gonna cooperate. You're gonna give us your information. No one gets to play the 'I didn't do anything wrong' card here." Marcus swallowed hard, his mind racing. The thought crossed his mind that he could just walk away, that he could call out and make a scene, maybe get the attention of a bystander. But that would only escalate things further. He knew the rules, the hard, brutal rules of being a black teenager, alone in a situation like this. His options were limited, and every step he took could be a misstep. Without warning, the officer grabbed Marcus's arm, pulling him back towards the car. "Hey! What the hell are you doing?" Marcus snapped, jerking his arm away. He hadn't expected it to escalate like that. "Don't touch me!" Marcus's voice rose with an edge of panic. "I'm just trying to get home, man. You want to search me? Fine, but you don't touch me like that." The recruit finally took a step forward, looking hesitant, like he was about to say something. But then the older officer barked at him to stay back. "Get him up against the car," the officer ordered. And suddenly, Marcus was being pushed, his back colliding with the cold metal of the patrol car. The other two officers closed in. Marcus's breath hitched, and his heart started pounding harder in his chest. He knew this game. He'd seen it happen before. To friends, to strangers, even to his own brother. But now that it was happening to him, it felt different. It felt like his whole body was on fire, his anger and frustration mixing with a deep underlying fear. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The older officer began rifling through Marcus's backpack, pulling out his books, his notebook, his lunchbox, like they were expecting to find something, anything, out of place. One of the officers ran his fingers through the contents, muttering to himself as if Marcus's life could be solved with the contents of his backpack. "Why the hell do you need a whole pack of gum?" the officer sneered, holding up a plastic bag of gum like it was some kind of contraband. Marcus's eyes widened. "Seriously? You're accusing me of having gum?" He couldn't believe it. The absurdity of it all was so ridiculous he almost laughed. "What? Am I supposed to be smuggling something in it?" "Shut up," the officer snapped, tossing the gum aside and continuing his search. Marcus gritted his teeth, his hands trembling. He knew he couldn't lose it. He couldn't show them he was scared, but this was ridiculous. This wasn't just an interrogation. It was harassment. He wanted to yell, to fight back. His body was screaming for him to do something, anything. But he couldn't. He clenched his fists, eyes narrowed, but he stayed silent. The conflict inside him was growing. A constant tug-of-war between what he wanted to say and what he knew he had to say to survive the situation. He was stuck in a moment of forced compliance. Because sometimes, the wrong move didn't just end with a bad day, it could end with something much worse. But it didn't make the situation any less infuriating. The tension in the air had thickened to a near suffocating level. Marcus's heart was pounding in his chest, and his body was tensed in a way he couldn't shake. His arms were pinned against the cold metal of the patrol car, and the officers were still rifling through his belongings as if looking for a reason to justify their behavior. His patience was running thin, but he held his tongue, letting the heat of his frustration simmer beneath the surface. He just needed to get through this. "What's this?" one of the officers asked, holding up his wallet. He flicked it open with a suspicious glance at Marcus, as though the teen might have hidden something dangerous between his ID and his student pass. Marcus bit his lip, trying to remain calm, knowing that any sign of defiance could turn this whole thing into a full-blown nightmare. The recruit still stood to the side, his face pale and uneasy. Marcus saw the rookie glance over at the other officer as if silently hoping someone would tell him how to handle the situation. But it wasn't the recruit that broke the tension. It was the voice of another officer, deeper, more authoritative, that cut through the air like a sudden gust of wind. "Hey, what the hell's going on here?" The group froze. Marcus, still pressed against the car, felt the officer's hands pull away from his backpack. The newcomer, an older officer with a weathered face and the kind of presence that could shut down a room, walked into view. His uniform was pristine with a few gold stripes on his shoulder. He was tall, built like someone who spent more time in the gym than the squad car, but his presence was less about physicality and more about experience. His eyes scanned the scene quickly, noting the tense posture of the officers and the teenager they had surrounded. "What's the situation?" he asked, his voice carrying an edge that made the younger officers straighten up. The first officer, the one who had been interrogating Marcus, gave a quick, sharp nod. "We've got a suspicious individual here. We're just doing a routine check." The new officer's gaze flicked to Marcus, and for a moment his eyes softened, almost imperceptibly. He gave a small frown before looking back at his subordinates. "I can see that. But this doesn't look like a routine check. You've got a kid up against a car, rifling through his stuff, and I don't see any probable cause. Care to explain that to me?" His tone had shifted, now more pointed, his gaze turning from the officers to Marcus. There was something in the way he looked at him, like he had seen him before but couldn't quite place where. The younger officers exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of how to respond to the higher-ranking officer's sudden shift in authority. The recruit shifted his weight nervously, stepping back slightly as if hoping to disappear into the shadows. The officer's eyes remained on Marcus for a moment longer. He stepped closer, his brow furrowed as he studied the teen. There was something familiar about him, something about the posture, the way he held himself, even the casual defiance in his eyes. "Wait a minute," the officer muttered, his voice trailing off as recognition dawned. His gaze flicked toward the other officers, now more scrutinizing, and he began to piece things together. Marcus caught his look and knew immediately what was happening. He wasn't sure whether to laugh or be irritated. "So, it takes a sergeant to figure out I'm not some random troublemaker?" Marcus asked, the sarcasm back in full force. He was so done with this. But as the words left his mouth, he let a little piece of information slip. Something casual, almost offhand, but it would be enough to trigger the officer's full recognition. "Yeah," Marcus continued, his tone light, but with a wry smile. "I guess you could say I'm not just another kid wandering around. My last name's Williams, Chief Williams's son, if that helps." The moment those words left his lips, the shift was immediate. The officer's face went from frustration to shock in the span of a heartbeat. His mouth opened slightly, and for a moment he stood there as though trying to digest what Marcus had just said. He looked from Marcus to the other officers, then back again, his expression slowly morphing into something close to panic. "Wait!" The officer's voice faltered as his eyes widened in realization. "Did you just say—" "Yeah, I said it," Marcus cut him off, now fully aware of the direction this was heading. "I'm Chief Williams's son." The higher-ranking officer's entire demeanor shifted. His shoulders slumped as though the weight of the world had just been dropped on him. He took a step back, his eyes darting nervously between Marcus and the officers under his command. The first officer, who had been the most aggressive, suddenly looked like he'd just been caught in a lie. His hands fell awkwardly to his sides, his mouth working to form words that never came. He looked down at his boots, clearly not prepared for the bombshell that Marcus had just dropped. The other officer, who had been silently standing aside, looked as if he wanted to melt into the pavement. The recruit shot a panicked glance at the sergeant, as if looking for guidance, but the sergeant didn't know what to say. A few awkward seconds passed. The world around them seemed to slow down. The bustling streets suddenly muted as everyone involved tried to process the shift that had just occurred. Marcus couldn't help but chuckle, though the laugh held no humor. "What? Didn't think the chief's kid would be walking around here?" he said, his voice dripping with irony. "You'd think you'd recognize me from the press conferences. Or maybe my dad's annual community events. But hey, maybe I'm just suspicious like every other kid, right?" The sergeant's eyes darted to the side, his face flushed with embarrassment. He cleared his throat awkwardly, stepping forward with his hand extended toward Marcus in a half-hearted attempt to smooth things over. "Look, kid," he began, his voice now faltering with discomfort. "I didn't know. Look, we were just doing our job." His words came out in a rush, but they felt hollow. "It was a mistake. We didn't mean... We just thought—" "Yeah, you thought," Marcus interrupted, his voice steady now but with a hint of disbelief. "Well, maybe next time you'll think a little harder before you start harassing people on their walk home." The sergeant turned to the other officers, his tone shifting to one of hurried authority. "Let's get this cleaned up. Now." His voice carried that sharpness that Marcus had heard 1,000 times before, except now it had a nervous edge, as if trying to cover up a mistake before it got any worse. The older officer's face was red with embarrassment, but Marcus was no longer concerned with their discomfort. He had gotten the last word, and somehow that felt satisfying. As the officers quickly packed up their things, trying to move on from the awkward scene they had created, Marcus stood there for a second longer, the weight of the moment sinking in. It wasn't just about the injustice he'd faced. It was about the realization that power dynamics were everything. The moment they realized who he was, their attitudes changed instantly. They froze, scrambling to cover their tracks because suddenly they weren't dealing with a random kid. They were dealing with the son of the chief. Marcus couldn't help but shake his head as he started walking away, the evening air feeling suddenly lighter. But even as he stepped into the distance, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. The tension that had hung in the air now dissipated. But the weight of what had just happened pressed down on Marcus like an invisible hand. He didn't look back as he walked away, but the image of the officers scrambling to cover their tracks stayed with him. They were trying to fix something that couldn't be fixed. The damage was done. Marcus pulled out his phone as he rounded the corner of the block, his fingers tapping at the screen. He needed to make sure everything was okay at home before his dad found out about the fiasco. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, in a corner office high above the city, the phone rang in Chief Williams's office. The chief had just finished a meeting when the call came through. The moment he saw the number on the screen, his expression darkened. His jaw tightened. It was an unknown number at first, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Chief Williams," the voice began, strained and formal. "We've got a situation." The chief stood up from his desk, the phone pressed to his ear. "What now?" His voice was low but edged with a hint of worry. "Well, sir," the officer on the other end stammered. "Your son... There's been an incident. It seems one of our patrol units stopped him while he was walking home. We didn't realize who he was. We treated him like anyone else." There was a long pause on the line. The chief was quiet, his hand gripping the phone harder than necessary. "Go on," he said, his voice now ice-cold. The officer continued, stammering as the words came out. "Sir, we thought he was just a kid hanging around. There was some attitude from him and, well, we did our job. But when he mentioned his last name, we realized who he was. We stopped him. He wasn't doing anything wrong, but we kind of escalated things. He said he was your son, and we didn't handle it right." A flush of heat ran through the chief's chest. The anger was building, but it wasn't the kind of anger he could let loose. Not yet. "Are you telling me," the chief began, his voice low and controlled, "that my son, my 15-year-old son, was just harassed on the street by a couple of your officers because they thought he was suspicious?" There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. The officer clearly regretted the moment he'd made the call. "Sir, I understand how this sounds, but—" "No," the chief cut him off, his tone hardening. "It doesn't sound any way. It is what it is. Now get your people in line and get back to the station. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Before the officer could respond, the chief hung up. He was fuming, his hands clenched into fists as he walked to the window of his office. He looked down at the city below, but his mind wasn't on the view. It was on his son. Meanwhile, back on the street, the officers who had been involved in the incident were left to pick up the pieces. The group stood in a huddle, awkwardly shifting their feet. The sudden realization of what they'd done hung heavily between them. The older officer, who had been the most aggressive, Officer Hayes, was pacing back and forth, muttering to himself. "This is a mess," he grumbled. "It's just a kid. Why'd I have to be so harsh? Why didn't someone say something?" The recruit, Officer Daniels, was standing off to the side, looking thoroughly uncomfortable. His face was pale, and his hands kept fiddling with the hem of his uniform. "I mean, I didn't really think we were doing anything wrong," he said, his voice faltering. "We were just doing our job. But, it didn't feel right, you know?" Hayes shot him an exasperated look. "Of course it didn't feel right, Daniels. You've been in the field for, what, 6 months? You can't be that green. That kid, Williams' kid, was just minding his business. We made him a target." He let out a frustrated sigh, rubbing his temples. "I wasn't the one who went all in with the questioning," Daniels mumbled, but Hayes wasn't done. "Stop trying to justify it. You know better than this. We all know better than this." Hayes's voice had an edge of frustration, but also guilt. "Hell, he wasn't even acting up. What's wrong with us?" The other officer, a more experienced patrolman named Officer Barrett, chimed in, his voice tired but calm. "We messed up, Hayes. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. We've been doing this job for years, and we've seen all sorts. But we crossed a line today, and now we have to deal with the consequences." Barrett's words hit Hayes like a punch. He stopped pacing and looked at the other two officers. Yeah, you're right. But what do we do now?" "Well, the chief's gonna hear about this," Barrett said, his voice grim. "And he's not gonna be happy. That kid isn't just any kid. We really messed this one up." Back at home, Marcus had just walked through the door when his phone buzzed again. He recognized the number immediately. His dad. He took a deep breath and answered. "Hey, Dad," Marcus said casually, though his heart was still racing from everything that had happened. "Marcus," the chief's voice came through, tight with anger. "Where are you?" "I'm at home, Dad." "What's up? What happened today? With the cops?" Marcus's heart sank, but he tried to keep his voice even. "It was nothing. Just a misunderstanding. They stopped me for no reason, but I told them who I was. They weren't too happy about it. They're probably not going to make that mistake again." There was a brief silence on the other end, before his dad spoke again, his voice far more measured. "Listen, Marcus, you don't ever have to deal with that again, okay? I'll handle this. You stay out of it. Just stay home." Marcus wasn't sure what to say. His dad's anger was palpable, but it was more than that. There was embarrassment in his tone, a sense of personal failure. As chief of police, the weight of the system was on him every day. But this was something different. His son had been treated like a criminal simply because of his appearance, and it was a stain he couldn't ignore. Marcus nodded, even though his dad couldn't see it. "I'm fine, Dad. Just don't let this get out of hand, okay? It's not worth it." The chief let out a sharp breath. I know. But you need to understand something, son. No one should ever have to go through what you just did. No one. And I'm going to make sure it never happens again. I'm sorry you had to experience that." Marcus stood in the silence that followed. There was no anger in him now, no fire. He wasn't going to hold it against anyone. Not really. He just wanted things to be fair, wanted to walk down the street without being harassed. But the truth hung between them, unspoken. Today wasn't just about a bad day on the street. It was about something bigger. Something that no matter how much his dad tried to fix it, wasn't going to change overnight. "I'll be here," Marcus finally said, his voice steady. "Just handle it, okay?" "Yeah, I'll handle it," the chief replied, but neither of them were convinced that it would be that easy. As the phone call ended, Marcus stood by the window, looking out at the night sky. It was dark now, darker than he wanted it to be. But somehow he felt a little bit lighter, a little more in control. He wasn't just the chief's son anymore. Today, he had learned something important. Sometimes power wasn't in the hands of the person with the badge. Sometimes it was in the hands of the one who didn't need it. The city was quiet that night. The streets, bathed in the soft yellow glow of streetlights, seemed far away from the chaos that had unfolded just hours earlier. Inside the chief's home, the weight of the day's events sat heavily on his shoulders. His uniform was off, replaced by an old t-shirt and jeans, but the tension in his body had not yet left. He sat in the dim light of the living room, staring out the window, lost in thought. It was moments like this, when the world outside was still, that he found himself questioning everything. He had been on the force for over 20 years. In that time, he had seen it all: shootings, protests, riots, police reform discussions that never went anywhere. He had built a reputation of being tough but fair, of standing by his officers, of being a man who could bring change. But tonight, in the quiet solitude of his own home, that reputation seemed fragile, hollow even. The phone call had been the start of it. Hearing that his son had been treated like a criminal by the very people who were supposed to protect him had sent a jolt of fury through his veins. But there was more. So much more. The chief closed his eyes for a moment, running a hand over his face, the guilt creeping in. Why did it take me so long to figure it out? Why didn't I see the signs? I should have known. It's my own son. He had always known the system was broken, but he had never fully understood it. Not until it was his own flesh and blood on the receiving end of it. His mind kept going back to the faces of the officers, their uncertainty, their rush to cover up their mistakes, their immediate assumption that Marcus was suspicious. The way they had treated him like any other teenager on the street, simply because of how he looked. Is that the culture I've been a part of? Have I been blind to what's really happening in my own precinct? Have I been too comfortable? Too complacent? The chief leaned back in his chair, his eyes staring at the darkening sky outside. His position in the department had always come with a certain privilege. He was the chief. He was a man of authority. But as he thought about it now, his power had come with an undeniable blind spot, a protection that Marcus, as the child of a high-ranking officer, had never been able to escape. Even with all his advantages, even with his father's influence, Marcus wasn't immune to the biases that shaped the system. This is bigger than one incident. This is bigger than my department. This is a system that's been in place for so long that it feels invisible, but it's everywhere, on the streets, in the precincts, in the courtrooms. The words of his son echoed in his mind. No one should ever have to go through what I just did. It stung. It stung more than he wanted to admit. Later that evening, after the quiet of the house had settled in, Marcus came downstairs, his footsteps soft on the hardwood floor. The chief had been lost in his thoughts for hours, but the presence of his son brought him back into the moment. Marcus stood in the doorway watching his father for a long time before speaking. "You okay?" The chief didn't immediately respond. He looked at his son, at the calm, collected way he carried himself, despite everything that had just happened. He felt both proud and guilty in that moment. Proud that Marcus hadn't let the incident break him, but guilty for not protecting him better. "I should have been there," the chief said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of the guilt he had been carrying all day. "You shouldn't have had to deal with that, Marcus. I'm sorry." Marcus walked over to the couch and sat down beside him. He looked at his father, then at the floor, as if gathering the words. Finally he spoke, his voice calm but steady. "Dad, I know you didn't mean for that to happen. I know you've got a lot to juggle with the job, and I know you want to make things better. But it's not just about you. It's about everyone. I mean, you know it's bigger than one bad day with some officers. It's about the way people see us, people like me, every single day. The thing is, You and we're not the same. You don't have to worry about getting stopped just because of how you look. You've got the badge, you've got the power. I don't have that. And I don't even know if I want it. I just want it to be different." The chief turned his head slowly, looking at his son with a mix of admiration and sorrow. "I don't know if I can fix all of it, Marcus. This goes so much deeper than I ever realized. But what I can do is make sure it doesn't happen again. Not to you, and not to anyone else." There was a long pause, the kind of silence that held the weight of years of unspoken truths. Finally, Marcus nodded. "I just want to be safe, Dad. I want my friends to be safe. I want the people in our community to be safe, no matter who they are. It's not about me or you, it's about everyone." The chief's chest tightened. He had always believed in justice, but now he understood, truly understood, that the system he was a part of wasn't always just. "I'll make sure we do something about it," the chief said, his voice more resolute now. "Not just talk about it. I'll address it with the department. I'll take steps to make sure the officers who are involved understand the consequences of their actions. And I'll make sure this never happens to anyone else ever again. I promise you that." Marcus sat back, letting his father's words settle between them. There was a long way to go, but it was a start. It wasn't a solution, but it was the first step toward one. The chief sat back, letting out a heavy breath. He had been stuck in a system for so long that he hadn't noticed the cracks, hadn't seen how deep the problem went. But now he had a clear path forward, even if it was difficult. He was going to be the change he had always wanted to see, starting with his own department. The next morning, he attended a community meeting at the local church, one that had been scheduled for weeks but had taken on a new personal meaning after the events of the day before. It was a space for open dialogue between the police department and the people they served, an opportunity to heal the growing rift between the two. The chief addressed the crowd, his words measured but passionate. "This city deserves better," he said, his voice steady and firm. "And as chief of police, I am committed to ensuring that the department reflects that. No one should ever feel unsafe because of who they are, where they live, or what they look like. I promise you, we will work harder to earn your trust, to build a department that serves everyone, not just the people who look like me." The room was quiet for a moment, but the chief saw the small nods of approval, the hopeful expressions on the faces in the crowd. It was a start. It was only the beginning, but it was something. As he left the meeting, he felt lighter than he had in days. The weight of his guilt hadn't fully lifted, but there was a new sense of purpose in his chest. Change was coming, not just for his son, but for the community. And for the first time in a long time, the chief felt like he was on the right path. The city had moved on. People were going about their lives, riding the bus, grabbing coffee, honking at each other in traffic. But for those who had witnessed the events surrounding Marcus Williams, things felt just a little different. Not because the streets were any less crowded or the weather any better, but because there had been a shift. It wasn't a sudden one. It wasn't a miracle. But change, as it often does, began quietly, almost imperceptibly. Marcus had become something of an unofficial local hero. Not because he had done anything particularly extraordinary, he was just a teenager who got harassed by some cops. But the way he handled it, the way he didn't let the injustice of the situation break him, resonated. "Hey man, you're like kind of famous now, huh?" His friend Dylan teased the next day at school, his grin wide and genuine. Marcus looked at him with a raised eyebrow. "Yeah, I guess. Some kind of local legend. I should probably get a cape or something. Maybe a t-shirt. You know, survived the cop stop, got the badge of honor." Dylan chuckled, slapping Marcus on the back. "Well, I can't say I've had that kind of fame. Just the usual high school rumors." Marcus smirked. "Rumors are overrated. You should try getting interrogated by 3 grown men while walking home. Way more street cred." But despite the lighthearted banter, Marcus knew the reality of what had happened wasn't something you could laugh off entirely. His experience had sparked something more, a real conversation about what happened, why it happened, and how it couldn't happen again. It wasn't about making noise for the sake of it. It was about finding a way forward, even if it meant confronting difficult truths. Meanwhile, his father, Chief Williams, was still processing the events from that day, but he had begun to make real changes. The precinct had opened up a series of mandatory workshops for officers, focusing on biases, community policing, and the systemic issues that sometimes went unnoticed. For the chief, these weren't just training sessions. They were personal. Every time he stood in front of his officers, his son's face loomed in his mind. It wasn't just about the officers making mistakes. It was about the culture that had allowed it to happen in the first place. And slowly but surely, the chief was starting to break down that culture, brick by brick. One afternoon, as he passed through the precinct, a rookie officer caught up with him, a nervous look on his face. "Chief, I just wanted to thank you for pushing us on those workshops. I never realized how much I was letting my own assumptions slip into my work. It's not easy, but I'm learning." The chief nodded, his voice even but carrying a quiet pride. "Good. That's the point. It's not easy, but it's necessary. We've got a long way to go, but we're getting there." As the days passed, the Williams family returned to a sense of normalcy, at least the kind of normalcy that had been punctured by the tension of the past week. But even in the quiet moments, like when Marcus and his father sat in the living room watching TV after dinner, they both knew that things had changed. "I never really got what you were up against, you know," Marcus said one evening, after the two had finished talking about what had happened at the community meeting. "I mean, I always knew you worked hard, but now it's like you're up against this thing that's way bigger than you ever thought." The chief exhaled softly, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Yeah, well, now I know exactly what you've been going through. I guess we both learned something, huh?" Marcus nodded, then chuckled softly. "I guess so. But you know, next time I get stopped by a cop, I'm telling them I'm your son again. Maybe they'll think twice." The chief laughed, the sound a little rough, a little tired, but warm. "I don't think that'll work every time, son, but it's a start." The room fell into a comfortable silence as they both sat there, each lost in their own thoughts. For a while, neither of them spoke, but eventually, Marcus broke the stillness. "You know, Dad, I think maybe it's all worth it. If it gets better for other kids in the future, kids who don't have your last name." The chief met his son's eyes, feeling a wave of emotion that he didn't quite know how to express. "Yeah, Marcus, I think it will be. And we'll keep working on it. You've got my word on that." As the screen faded to black, the camera panned over a still street corner, the same one where the incident had unfolded days before. Life had resumed its rhythm, but the air was different now, charged with the subtle promise of change. A final voiceover echoed softly, Marcus's voice. "It's not enough to just get by. You've got to make sure things get better for everyone around you. For me, for my friends, for anyone who's ever felt like they don't belong in a world that's supposed to protect them. It's not about power. It's about fairness. It's about doing the right thing, even when it's hard." The words hung in the air for a moment, a quiet call to action. Then the chief's voice, low but resolute. "We'll get there. One step at a time." And with that, the screen faded to black.